introduction, Dave comes to us from Energy Monitor, actually in the water pavilion now in Sharm el Sheikh. So we're really excited to have Dave meet with us for about 15 minutes, answer some questions, give us a little peek under the veil of what it's like to be in Egypt at the water pavilion. By way of introduction, Dave is a senior writer for Energy Monitor, where he covers environmental and energy issues. He also covers European politics and policy for France 24, and I believe he's based out of Brussels. Hopefully I'm not too loud because he lost his earpiece there. Okay. Dave is, I guess, a alumni of New York University and got his journalism master's at Northwestern University. So the man is educated. So we're glad to have him join us from Egypt. So with that, I'll just dive into a couple questions. Dave, for those of us who are in DC, those of us who logged in from Europe for our earlier panel, and just our virtual audience in general, give us a sense of what it's like to be there in Sharm el Sheikh in the water pavilion, and what it's like to be at COP27. Give us a little peek under the veil, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. Well, it is chaotic, but the stories are all true. Some people have called this the fire festival of COPs. This is my 5th COP I've been to, actually. And look, they're always chaotic. This is an intense experience when you're here, because you're cramming in all of these meetings in a very short period of time. You have people coming from all over the world. It is a very, very hard thing to organize. That being said, this is probably, in terms of the organization, some of the COP with the most difficulties I've ever seen. Yeah, like I say, it's a hard enterprise. So I'm here at the water pavilion, which is in the blue zone of the COP. So at the COPs, you have, I mean, most people know about the political negotiations, right? The things that are going on in the behind the scenes rooms, but also in the plenaries where they're actually adopting the global agreements. But on the sidelines, there are all these pavilions with businesses, with countries, regions, NGOs, you name it. Even the Francophonie, the organization of the French language, has a pavilion here, I noticed. This is actually something that's been increasing over the past decade. So my very first COP was in Copenhagen in 2009, and they were so much smaller back then. Now you have more and more businesses wanting to set up their pavilions on the sidelines here, which has made this an increasingly complicated thing to organize, because you have all these businesses here. It's really enormous. I don't think I could overstate just how big this whole complex is. It is so big that some of the areas you need a shuttle to get to the other areas. But the reason for that increasing business presence here is because businesses are, some people have a cynical take on that, and they say, oh, it's corporate capture of the climate negotiations. But I think businesses are more and more understanding that they want to be there at the table to tell policymakers what they need to put new technological solutions into effect, but also so they don't miss business opportunities out of the energy transition. So it's been interesting to be here, walk around to all the different pavilions, and hear in particular about all these new interesting technologies that are being used to fight climate change. So these COPs are not just about the political negotiations, they're also about all of the delegates that come from all over the world exchanging ideas and how to move the needle forward in terms of reducing emissions and getting new green technologies, the funding that they need, and the political support that they need.
Great, Dave. Thank you for that. You're coming to us, obviously, from the water pavilion, so maybe I'll drill down a little bit and ask you a question about the water sector itself. What are some of the key themes that you're picking up now that you're on the ground in Sharm el Sheikh at the water pavilion? What are some of the key themes folks are talking about, whether it's the NGO community, whether it's businesses, whether it's governmental representatives in the water sector? What are some of the key themes that you're picking up now that you're there on the ground?
Yeah, so water is a really main focus this year because Egypt is the host, and for Egypt, the Nile is a crucially important river. I mean, it's what defines this country, and so they have put water on the agenda here. It's actually the Egyptian Water Ministry that set up this pavilion behind me. So you can see there's like a platform there with different seats. So they've been doing events where they're talking to various stakeholders about, I think, both the threats that the world faces in terms of water scarcity. When we're talking about adaptation, that's definitely a focus here. But there's also been a focus here on how water can play a part in reducing emissions. So just earlier, there was a panel where people were talking about the role that water can play in helping to decarbonize. So it's both looking at adaptation and mitigation. And you can see as well behind me that there's this wall here and over there, actually, with all the sponsors of this pavilion. So though this pavilion is from the water ministry in Egypt, you have a lot of companies, a lot of different entities who are interested in getting involved with this. And there's different showcasing of different water technologies, again, both for dealing with the effects of climate change and for having water play its role in reducing emissions.
That's great, Dave. And certainly decarbonization in the water sector was a key theme that we've been talking about throughout the day on some of our earlier panels. So certainly glad to hear that what we're talking about here has a direct nexus to what's going on in the water pavilion. As you said, you've been to several of these in a row, starting with Copenhagen. I imagine there's a certain rhythm to these types of COP events. I guess what I'm curious to know are what are some of the headlines that are really jumping out that kind of breaks from the status quo? What are some things that you didn't anticipate that wasn't really part of the regularly scheduled programming for the COP event? What are some key headlines that you're picking up, whether it's more generally in COP27 or whether it's specifically coming out of the water sector and the water pavilion?
Yeah, I can speak more generally and then maybe to the water sector specifically. So actually, just today we had a really unusual day because the president-elect of Brazil, Lula, came here unexpectedly. He was not supposed to come. He's not the president yet. Brazil has a system similar to the United States where you have this lame duck period between an election and when a president takes office. He's not going to take office until the 1st of January. So why is he here? Well, the Egyptians invited him because there's been a lot of confusion, especially here over the past 2 weeks, but even in the months leading up to it, from the Brazilian Foreign Service, because their boss is still Jair Bolsonaro, who is an unabashed enemy of the UN climate process. He has threatened to take Brazil out of the UN FCCC process. He's threatened to take Brazil out of the Paris Agreement several times. He never pulled the trigger on that like Donald Trump did, but he is certainly no friend to these talks. But his negotiators here, the delegates, whether they want to or not, clearly feel that over the past week and a half, they have had to toe that line. Even though I know for a fact that don't all feel that way, right? But they're in a very awkward position here because Lula is not yet the president. So he came today. We're speaking at a lot of side events. I was just covering his speech that he gave at one of the side pavilions here for a live with France 24 is another place I work for. And it was wild. I mean, the people were just going crazy. Not just NGOs. I saw Brazilian business people, in there who I know from previous interviews in their suits, really like almost weeping that Lula is here. For Brazilians, this is a really, really big moment, especially for Brazilians who follow the climate process. They have been so locked out by their own government for so long now that there was really a sense of jubilation here. And Lula had a lot of big promises today. He wants to host the next COP that doesn't have a host yet. So that is the one in 2025. He wants to host that in the Amazon rainforest, which if you think doing it here in the desert was difficult, try the rainforest in the middle of Brazil. That's going to be logistically challenging to say the least, but he was definitely fired up here. So that was unusual in that you have a non-president, someone who by definition at the moment is a civilian. The organizer had to somehow work him into events here, but he can't represent Brazil in any way. He can't speak at the plenary representing Brazil. So he's just been doing all these side events and he's been just thronged with supporters. On water specifically, as I mentioned, water is so essentially important to Egypt that they put this at the center of the agenda here. So where I'm located here at the Water Pavilion, this is pride of place. These are important pavilions around here. So right across from me, I've got Germany. They've got a reception here. People are just getting their drinks. They look very exhausted and excited to have a drink. You've got the EU pavilion that is always one of the main pavilions at the COPs. You have the Saudi pavilion, which is huge. So the location of this pavilion, I think, shows how much the organizers have put water at the heart of discussions this year, which wasn't always the case in previous COPs.
That's very interesting, Dave. Drilling down a little bit, obviously, Egypt, very arid country, and very different water resources demands on their communities. Brazil potentially putting their hat in the ring for hosting the next COP event in the Amazon River. Clearly a different set of water issues. How much of the conversation is guided by the host country? Do you find that water scarcity, aridification, transboundary water management, clearly Egypt and some of its southern neighbors are having some struggles in transboundary water management. How much does the host country get to dictate or have a say in programming, I guess specifically at the Water Pavilion, versus kind of global issues, things like flooding that may not be nearly as big of an issue in some parts of the world as another? How does that work as far as programming goes?
Yeah, for sure. The host country has a good amount of leeway to put things on the agenda. That's why we have seen a lot of discussion around water. In fact, there's been thematic days over the past 2 weeks. So Monday was the day here that was dedicated to water. So you can see in the choice there, Egypt is very much focused here on adaptation, and they are really pushing this loss and damage issue. So this is supposed to be a fund that would, some people call it climate reparations, right? So it's the rich countries paying for the carbon that they have emitted, which is now causing climate problems for developing countries. So it's a fund where they pay them for the loss and damage that they've been experiencing. Egypt has taken the reins here in representing, I think, the African continent as a whole in terms of pushing for that loss and damage fund to be agreed here at this COP. I think it's very unlikely that it will be agreed at this COP because the EU and the US, they consented to put it on the agenda this year, but everyone I talked to in those delegations has said this is really for something next year, COP28 in the United Arab Emirates, another desert country. So, nevertheless, I think the talks are going to go quite late, probably until Saturday night at least, because those developing countries need to show their citizens that they fought as hard as they could to get loss and damage agreed in the text, even though I don't expect it will be. But in terms of the desert atmosphere, I mean, it is, when you look out the windows here, the press center, for instance, has these huge windows that overlook the desert. It is a weird feeling to be in the middle of a desert as we're talking about issues like desertification. It really brings it home. Interestingly, you mentioned some of the water management issues that Egypt has had with its neighbors. I haven't seen Egypt bring that up at all while I've been here. Maybe that they did and I missed it. But I think that issues like that, which are kind of very political and also quite regional in terms of the politics, I think it would be kind of frowned on to try to insert that into the talks here. But they may be having those discussions more quietly on the sidelines.
Excellent. I'm going to pause for my questions and see whether online we have any questions coming in or whether anyone here in the audience wants to ask a question of Dave since we have him here. Otherwise, I'm more than happy to keep going. I have a question in the back. I'm going to provide a microphone so that we can capture this for our online viewers. If you could just introduce yourself for our audience. Dave, were you able to hear that, or do you want me to? Would it be helpful if I repeated the question?
No, I didn't hear it. So if you could repeat it.
Absolutely. So the question was from Water Aid, who's in attendance here, and the question was climate migration for folks who are impacted by climate change, climate impacts. How much of the conversation there is talking about relocating folks and what can be done to ensure the safety of communities moving forward?
Yeah, it's interesting. There have been a number of side events on that subject. It was not a thematic day, so I haven't seen it prioritized necessarily by the Egyptians, but there have been a lot of side events on this issue. In fact, I know my colleague last Thursday went to one. I'm not exactly sure what pavilion it was in, but it's definitely on the radar here. But I wouldn't say it's been prioritized by the Egyptian presidency.
Thank you, Dave. We've got another question in the audience.
Hi there.
Go ahead.
I'm Maya. I'm with the Reservoir Center. For those who aren't familiar with the COP Water Pavilion thematic days, I wanted to ask if you could remind everyone what today's theme is and what themes you remember from the past few days and any stand out to you.
For the water pavilion specifically, I haven't been here every day, so I couldn't tell you what the themes have been. I've just been kind of in and out here.
All right. Well, with that, I guess the question that was on my mind, given that we've had a really healthy cross-section of water utilities on earlier panels, some folks that are involved in finance or represent technology companies. The question I had to you is, given the costs associated with climate change, its impact on communities when it comes to the whole range of different climate-related impacts, are you picking up much in the Water Pavilion about conversations between businesses, between governments, between NGOs, on how to kind of bring together kind of public and private enterprises in order to either bolster climate resiliency or a big topic of conversation in our conversations earlier today was the notion of net zero carbon emissions in the water sector or decarbonization of the water sector. So whether it's on the adaptation resilience side or whether it's on the mitigation side, are you seeing much engagement between the private sector and the public sector? And is there any developments worth reporting out on?
Yeah, I am. I mean, that is, like I was saying at the beginning, this is one of the big points for the businesses to come here, to be talking to the delegates, to be talking to the policymakers, and to be trying to make these public-private partnerships. But I will say, so I've been doing a number of interviews over the past days with business representatives here, and they have been, as a theme, I've consistently heard that they've been frustrated by the lack of time they've been able to get with policymakers. Maybe they would always complain. I mean, obviously, lobbyists will always want more time with policymakers than they're getting. But the way that the area is set out, so I'm in the blue zone now. This is for delegates, for businesses, for just attendees. Then there's the green zone, there's the red zone, there's all these other zones that we can't, as press, I can't go into. Delegates who are here, say representing a business, can't go into the area where the political discussions are happening. You could go kind of, well, I can go outside of it as press. I don't think they can. But anyway, it is a little separated here in terms of the business people, the NGO people, the finance part that would want to connect with policymakers to talk about these public-private partnerships. And I would imagine with water as well, that's also part of the issue. Now, I'm sure there have been lots of discussions that have been happening here behind me at the Water Pavilion over the past days where people are finding common cause, finding possibilities for public-private partnerships. But I will say, I have heard this as a gripe the last days, that people haven't gotten as much face-to-face time with people from the public sector as they wanted.
Next question I had, Dave, circling back to earlier question or something you brought up as far as the role of geopolitics when it relates to either water management or climate change. I certainly heard that on a regional basis that hasn't been a huge focus, at least from Egypt's presentation and of the water pavilion. I guess beyond just that kind of regional basis, are you picking up any talks or engagement around other geopolitical hotspots? Let's say what's going on in Ukraine. Are folks thinking, talking in terms of the impact of geopolitics as it relates to the globe's ability to come together to tackle climate change. Is that a theme that you're picking up there in the Water Pavilion or otherwise?
For sure. The Ukraine war is the elephant in the room here. It is mentioned constantly every day. And one of the big themes that I was hearing in the initial days here, particularly from delegates from Africa, was look, why should we be scaling down our use of coal? Why should we be putting in these climate solutions when we keep reading that the EU has now gone full in on coal, that they're increasing their burning of coal power in response to the Ukraine war and in response to the resulting energy crisis, the supply crunch, and we're losing all of that Russian gas. And so, actually, when Franz Timmermans, the EU's executive vice president for climate, arrived here on Monday, this was his number one mission to dispel this narrative that has really taken hold here in the developing world from the developing world delegates that the EU is backing off on its climate commitment. So he has had a whole bunch of appearances and press conferences over the past couple of days where he keeps trying to drive home this point. The EU is still on track for its same climate targets. In fact, they're going to increase their emissions reduction for 2030 target from 55% to 57%. There's a little bit of wiggle room how they're getting to that number, but it's really about the narrative here that they're saying, look, there may be a little slight increase in coal generation because of the Ukraine war and the energy crisis, but this is not a change in plan. This is not a change in tact. We are still fully committed, and you guys should be too. But yeah, certainly the Ukraine war, it is all around us because it's so tightly connected to energy. I mean, it is so much an energy crisis for Europe, and I think Europe feels that in a way much more acutely than others from North America, for instance, or even from Africa. Also, the food crisis, the food supply issues that have been brought about by the Ukraine war, the grain crisis, the grain coming out of Ukraine, that has been a subject here brought up, even though it's not kind of directly related to climate in the acute sense in the short term. People are using it as an example of what happens when you have a scarcity of food, when you have disruptions in food supply. And of course, that's something that we expect to happen with adaptation measures.
Dave, I'm very impressed by your ability to keep going with the fly around you. You handled that quite well. So well done.
There are a lot of flies here.
We'll send you some bug spray. Last question I have before we kind of come to a close here is what are some of the storylines that you picked up while you were there at COP27 that you anticipate following up on, that are themes that really caught your attention, things that maybe were new issues that are worthy of a follow-up that you anticipate either yourself, your Energy Monitor, or other news organizations will plan to follow up in the days and months following COP27? What's your sense of what kind of headlines and articles can we look out for in the future?
Loss and damage surely isn't going anywhere. Like I said, I don't expect that to be agreed by the end of this week. So that's going to then rumble on over the next weeks. And the hope is that they can come to an agreement on that in a year in the United Arab Emirates, COP28. So that's something we'll be keeping an eye on for sure. And we'll be looking for signals of what they talked about over these past 2 weeks in terms of what could be agreed, what's feasible, what could the US and the EU agreed to, because they don't just want to hand over a blank check. That's what we keep hearing. So what would be the rules around this loss and damage fund? How can they design this in a way that the EU and the US are comfortable with? And I think the other big theme will be also this narrative. I don't think that Franz Timmermans was completely successful in dispelling this narrative that's taken hold here, that Europe is pulling back on its climate ambition in light of the Ukraine war and the energy crisis. So that's going to be a continuing theme, I think, especially as we get into the winter. We are at the mercy of Mother Nature in Europe over the next months. If this is a cold winter, a very cold winter, we are in trouble. If it's a regular winter, it looks like we've done pretty well in terms of gas storage, that we should be okay. Certainly, if it's a mild winter, we're okay. But of course, then we're thinking about the next winter. And the fear is that if energy prices really go crazy here, or if people start losing heat, if we're going to have to start rationing heat even to households and consumers, are people going to start saying, look, they're going to start blaming climate measures? We are hearing this from the Polish government. We're hearing this a lot on social media from right-wing media outlets in Europe. And if people are really suffering over the next months, you could get to a point where Europe actually does rein back its climate ambition. I would say that they haven't so far. We've had articles in Energy Monitor showing that the coal increase is really not going to affect the trajectory. Coal is going to die in Europe no matter what's happened over the past couple of months. But depending on how public opinion goes over the next months, that could be something that does become a reality.
Thanks for that reporting out, Dave. Really appreciate your time with us today, coming to us from Sharm el Sheikh. I'm sure you're quite busy with your time. I encourage our audience, whether virtually or in person, to give you a follow on Twitter to learn more about follow-up of COP27. I know you've been doing a lot of reporting and intend to follow up. So really appreciate your time, and thanks for joining us.